The private jet sat elegantly on the tarmac, its sleek body gleaming under the golden hues of the setting sun. To the ordinary eye, it was just another aircraft, but to those who understood its significance, it was a symbol of power, exclusivity, and untouchable wealth. Only the world's elite were permitted aboard: influential politicians, billionaire entrepreneurs, and global celebrities who had spent their lives accumulating wealth, prestige, and influence. To board this jet was not just about traveling, it was a statement. As the cabin doors swung open, the unmistakable aura of extravagance welcomed its passengers. Inside, it was a world of sheer opulence. The aroma of fresh leather and aged oak filled the air. The seats, crafted from the finest Italian leather, were wider than most first-class lounges. Each polished walnut table gleamed under the soft glow of golden ambient lighting, while crystal glasses stood ready, filled with the finest French wine. The passengers were relaxed, sipping on their premium drinks, flipping through business portfolios, or engaging in quiet conversations filled with confidence and self-assurance. Here, there was no rush, no chaos, only control, status, and the unspoken rule that respect was reserved for those who had earned their place among the privileged few. And then, amid this carefully curated world of affluence, an elderly black man quietly stepped onto the plane. He did not walk with the arrogance of a mogul, nor the entitlement of the rich. Instead, his movements were unhurried, purposeful, steady. His suit was not new, yet it was neatly pressed, its creases reflecting care rather than wealth. His leather shoes, though worn with age, were polished with the same level of precision as those who had chauffeurs at their disposal. There was no Rolex on his wrist, no expensive cologne trailing behind him, and no security entourage ensuring his comfort. But despite all that, he carried himself with a quiet dignity, one that spoke louder than any designer label ever could. There was an unshakable calmness in his demeanor, a serene certainty in his step. It was a presence that did not demand attention. Yet, for those who took a second glance, it was impossible to ignore. Mr. Johnson, 72 years old, stepped inside with a gentle, knowing smile. At first, no one paid him any attention, or if they did, it was only with a fleeting glance, one of silent judgment, of curiosity, or of casual dismissal. He did not belong here. That much was clear to them, and yet, he moved as if he did. Without a word, he made his way to his seat, settled in, closed his eyes, and began to pray. For a moment, the world around him faded. The whispers, the subtle glances, the silent assumptions, none of it mattered. But what no one on that flight knew was that, in just a few minutes, this flight would become the setting for one of the most profound lessons in humility, prejudice, and the justice of God. At the entrance of the lavish cabin, Madeline, the head flight attendant, stood with the poise of someone who had complete control over her domain. At 45 years old, with over 15 years of experience in the industry, she had mastered the art of observation. She didn't just serve passengers, she sized them up. Her sharp features and piercing gaze gave her an air of authority, the kind that made people stand up straighter, adjust their posture, and rethink their words before speaking to her. She had a talent, one she prided herself on immensely: the ability to read passengers at first glance. The tailored suits, the designer handbags, the subtle yet unmistakable confidence of the elite. She knew exactly who belonged here, and just as importantly, who didn't. And the moment her icy blue eyes landed on Mr. Johnson, she had already passed judgment. Her jaw tightened slightly. This man could not possibly be a VIP passenger. She didn't need to check the manifest. She didn't need to see his ticket. She just knew. Madeline subtly exhaled through her nose, irritation flickering across her otherwise perfectly controlled features. An old suit, no expensive watch on his wrist, no security detail escorting him. The signs were obvious. She had seen countless cases like this before. People trying to sneak into first class, hoping for a bit of luck or a mistake from the crew, hoping that if they played it cool enough, they'd go unnoticed. But not on her watch. She wasn't about to let this turn into one of those situations. Madeline's hand tightened slightly around the iPad she carried, her meticulously manicured nails tapping against the screen as she made her decision. She took a slow step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wooden floor of the cabin. Her stride was purposeful, unyielding, the kind that turned heads, even among those who were too preoccupied with their own importance to notice much of anything. She stopped directly in front of Mr. Johnson, positioning herself firmly in his path, as if her mere presence alone would force him to reconsider his actions. Her gaze swept over him from head to toe, assessing, dismissing, categorizing, and then she smiled. But it was not a warm smile. It was polished, practiced, the kind of customer service smile that concealed knives beneath its pleasantries. And when she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable edge of condescension, though it was expertly disguised as professional courtesy. "Sir, I believe you're in the wrong seat. This section is reserved for VIP passengers." The politeness in her tone was a mere formality, because what she was really saying was something else entirely. It wasn't just a reminder. It was a declaration, a denial of his presence, a way of saying, "You don't belong here." Mr. Johnson slowly opened his eyes. There was no anger in them, no frustration, no hint of offense, just a steady, unwavering calm. It was the kind of calm that came from years of experience, from walking through storms without ever letting the rain dictate his steps. A calm so profound that, instead of reassuring, it unsettled those who thrived on power. He took a measured breath, his voice even and unshaken as he spoke. "No, I believe this is my seat." The response was effortless, unbothered. For a fleeting second, it threw Madeline off balance. Her perfectly sculpted brows arched. She was used to people complying instantly, fumbling for their tickets, apologizing, scrambling to avoid embarrassment. But this man, this old black man in an outdated suit, just sat there. No panic, no hesitation, no shame. A murmur began spreading through the cabin. Passengers, once engrossed in their overpriced meals and idle conversations, started to take notice. Madeline crossed her arms, shifting her weight onto one foot, patience thinning. She did not like that answer. She was a woman who commanded order. She maintained control, and she was not about to let this minor disturbance unravel the authority she had spent years cultivating. So she leaned in, just enough to make her presence suffocating. Her voice, once smooth, sharpened like the edge of a blade. "Sir, I think you should double-check your ticket." A pause. Then, with a touch of condescension, she added, "I'm certain you're in the wrong seat." The cabin's atmosphere shifted instantly. What had been a quiet, indulgent hum of first-class luxury fizzled into silence. Heads turned, some discreetly, others openly, as the weight of the interaction settled between them all. A young businessman in an Armani suit leaned back, swirling his whiskey, a smirk tugging at his lips. His gaze flicked toward Mr. Johnson, not with curiosity, but with amusement, disdain. Nearby, a high-society woman with pearls draped over her wrist tilted her head toward her companion, a smirk half hidden by delicate, manicured fingers. "Does he really think he belongs here?" she murmured, not bothering to lower her voice. Another passenger, a distinguished gentleman with silver-streaked hair and a gleaming Patek Philippe watch, chuckled as he turned to the man beside him. Maybe he just wants to feel important. The murmurs turned to quiet chuckles, loud enough for Mr. Johnson to hear, loud enough for everyone to hear. And yet, he remained unmoved. Slowly, he lifted his head. His gaze met Madeline's, steady and unwavering. There was no defiance in his eyes, no aggression, no need to prove himself, only certainty, only power in its most understated form. His voice was soft, yet it carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. "You're welcome to check the passenger list if you'd like." Simple words, a fair request, a reasonable solution. But Madeline didn't even consider it. She didn't need a list to confirm what she already believed to be true. To her, a man like Mr. Johnson could not possibly belong in this world. She didn't need proof. She was certain. Silence thickened, pressing against the walls like an invisible force. Madeline's lips thinned. She had expected compliance, maybe even meek submission. But this man, this old, unremarkable black man in an outdated suit, was refusing to yield. Her nails dug into her palm as irritation crept up her spine. Enough. In one swift motion, she snatched the crumpled boarding pass from Mr. Johnson's tray table. A few gasps rippled through the cabin, but no one intervened. No one ever did. Her eyes flicked to the bold black letters. First class. Seat 3A. The very seat she had sworn he did not belong in. For a flicker of a second, disbelief crossed her face. She masked it quickly, her grip tightening on the ticket. No apology, no acknowledgement. Instead, her jaw clenched, and with a flick of her wrist, she tossed the ticket back onto the table. Then, without thinking, without hesitation, smack, a sharp slap echoed through the cabin. The slap hung in the air like an unfinished note, sharp and deafening in its silence. Passengers stared in frozen disbelief, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, as if their brains refused to process what had just unfolded before them. The weight of it all settled over the cabin, thick and suffocating. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed. A few hands subtly reached for their phones, but no one dared to be the first to break the moment. Madeline, however, did not freeze. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, her fingers trembling slightly as they curled into a fist. The realization of what she had done crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across her consciousness. She could feel the heat of dozens of eyes drilling into her, some in horror, some in judgment, and some in the kind of stunned curiosity that could only come from witnessing something irreversible. But she refused to back down. Not now. Not when her authority was on the line. So, she did what she had always done. She doubled down, straightening her posture. She exhaled sharply through her nose, eyes narrowing as she looked down at the man she had just struck. She expected to see anger, humiliation, maybe even fear. But instead, there was none of that. Mr. Johnson sat there, still and unmoving, as if the slap had been nothing more than a breeze passing through. His face remained calm, unshaken, unreadable, but his eyes told an entirely different story. There was no submission in them, no shock, no pain. There was only knowing, a deep, unwavering knowing that sent an unexpected chill down Madeline's spine. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Something about the way he looked at her, not with hatred, not even with anger, but with an eerie, almost divine patience, made her feel like the smallest person in the room. And that was a feeling she did not recognize. She did not like it. A sharp movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. One of the junior flight attendants, Grace, stood near the galley, hands clasped tightly together, her face a mixture of horror and disbelief. For a split second, Madeline saw something unexpected in the young woman's expression. Not just shock, Not just disapproval, but defiance. The kind of defiance that suggested that if Madeline pushed this any further, she might not be the only one speaking. That flicker of resistance infuriated her. She turned back toward Mr. Johnson, her heart pounding against her ribs, trying to steady her resolve. But before she could regain her composure, the cabin doors clicked open. A set of heavy, deliberate footsteps filled the cabin, moving with purpose, with urgency, and then a voice, one that made Madeline's blood turn cold. "Is there a problem here?" Passengers turned toward the sound, and then they saw him, the pilot, and he looked furious. A deathly silence gripped the cabin like a vice. It wasn't just a pause in conversation. It was a complete, suffocating stillness, the kind that only came when something unthinkable had just happened. The slap still echoed in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it, hanging in the air like an unspoken question. Did that really just happen? Every passenger sat motionless, their faces frozen somewhere between disbelief and discomfort, as if they had just watched something they were never supposed to see. But the most unsettling thing of all, Mr. Johnson did not move. He did not react. He did not touch his cheek. He did not even blink. He simply sat there, composed in a way that defied all expectations. It was as if the slap had never even landed. But there was one person who wasn't composed. Madeline. Her breathing hitched. Her fingers trembled at her sides. A stark contrast to the rigid posture she tried so desperately to maintain. This isn't right, she told herself. She had expected him to argue, to plead, to fumble for an explanation, anything that would reaffirm her belief that she was in the right. Instead, he had done nothing, and somehow, that was worse. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, judging, questioning, waiting. She needed control back, so she did what she always did. She scanned the room, seeking out an ally, a familiar expression that told her she had done the right thing. But for the first time in her career, she found none. All she saw were uneasy stares, lips pressed into thin lines, some eyes darting away to avoid meeting hers. And worse still, a few passengers were holding up their phones, their screens quietly capturing every second of her downfall. Her stomach twisted violently. This wasn't just an incident anymore. This was a spectacle, and she was at the center of it. No, she could fix this. She just had to act fast. Then, the cockpit door burst open. The entire plane flinched as the sudden, heavy sound shattered the silence. And then came footsteps. Fast, heavy, purposeful. Madeline's head snapped toward the noise just as the captain stormed into the cabin, his presence so commanding that even the passengers who had been whispering went completely still. His face was pale, beads of sweat glistening against his brow. His jaw was clenched tight, too tight. His eyes, dark and unreadable, weren't scanning the room. They weren't looking for an explanation. They were locked, solely, onto one person, Mr. Johnson, and then, to the absolute horror of every soul aboard that flight, the captain rushed forward and bowed, deeply, not a simple nod of acknowledgement, not a curt apology, a full, respectful, head-bowed, spine-bent gesture of deference. Gasps erupted across the cabin, the stunned reaction rippling like a shockwave. Madeline's heart stopped. Her throat tightened so much that breathing suddenly felt impossible. No, 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 this can't be happening. The captain's voice, usually steady, authoritative, controlled, came out trembling. "Sir, please forgive us. We had no idea you were on board." The words were like a gunshot. Madeline staggered back, her hands instinctively reaching for something, anything, to hold on to, as if she could physically keep herself from collapsing under the weight of those words. The entire plane sat in stunned disbelief. No one spoke. No one even breathed. It was as if the very air inside the aircraft had been sucked out, leaving behind only the crushing realization of what had just been revealed. Madeline's vision swayed. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she was aware of the passengers staring at her, not just watching anymore. They were witnessing. And for the first time in her entire life, Madeline felt small. She swallowed hard, her lips suddenly dry as sandpaper. Her mind raced for an explanation, a justification, a way out. Think, think, think. She needed to salvage this. She had to say something, had to regain control. Her mouth opened, but all she managed to choke out was, what's going on?" Her voice, shaky, unsteady, almost foreign to her own ears. Then, more desperate, who is he?" The captain slowly turned to her, and when his eyes met hers, her stomach dropped, because there was no sympathy in them. There was no patience, only disgust, only ice-cold contempt. And then, he spoke, and with just 5 words, Madeline's entire world came crashing down. "You don't know?" A slow, chilling pause. Then, "He's the owner of this airline." The words struck like a hammer. The cabin exploded. A collective gasp rang through the plane, followed by an eruption of hushed exclamations and frantic whispers. Some passengers covered their mouths, as if trying to physically contain their shock. Others simply stared, wide-eyed, open-mouthed, unable to believe what they had just heard. A woman in a designer dress let out a strangled noise, clutching at her pearls. A businessman who had smirked earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if suddenly unsure of his place in all of this. And the young man in the Armani suit? He looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. But none of them looked as destroyed as Madeline. She stood rigid, her spine straight as if frozen in place, her nails digging into her palms so hard she thought they might break skin. She had spent the last 15 minutes humiliating not just any passenger, but the very man who owned everything around her. The seats, the cabin, the plane, the entire airline. And worse, her job. Her face drained of color as the realization settled deep into her bones like ice. She had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. She needed to fix it. She had to fix it now, before it was too late. She tried to speak, tried to grasp for an explanation, tried to salvage whatever was left. But no words came out, because the truth was already undeniable, and it was far, far too late. The air inside the cabin was suffocatingly heavy, as if the weight of what had just happened pressed down on everyone's chest. Every passenger sat frozen in their seats, eyes locked onto the scene before them. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. And in the center of it all, standing tall with an unwavering presence, was Mr. Johnson. He did not raise his voice. He did not fume with anger. He did not demand vengeance. No, his silence spoke louder than any outburst ever could. A silence so absolute that it sent a cold shiver down Madeline's spine. She stood motionless, her breath shallow, her mind desperately racing to make sense of what was happening. Only moments ago, she had been in control, barking orders, exerting authority over a man she believed was beneath her. Now, she was powerless. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for some sort of support, for a single glance of validation from the wealthy passengers she had always served so diligently. But all she found were ashamed expressions, averted gazes, and, worst of all, several phones discreetly recording the moment her world came crashing down. Then, the cockpit door slammed open. The sharp sound echoed through the stunned silence, and heavy footsteps followed. The captain stormed into the cabin, his face pale, beads of sweat clinging to his forehead. He did not glance at the passengers. He did not acknowledge the crew. His eyes were locked solely onto Mr. Johnson. And then, in front of everyone, the captain bowed his head deeply. His voice trembled with a mix of fear and respect. "Sir, please forgive us. We had no idea you were on board." The entire cabin gasped. Madeline's heart nearly stopped. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Her brain tried to process what she had just heard, tried to piece together the impossible reality that was unraveling before her. Then, she heard the words that shattered her world completely. "You don't know?" The captain turned to her, his expression colder than she had ever seen. "He's the owner of this airline." A shockwave rippled through the cabin. Gasps, murmurs, the sound of someone dropping their drink. Passengers who had once sneered at Mr. Johnson now stared in horror. The businessman who had smirked? He sat paralyzed, gripping his armrest. The socialite who had mocked him? She clutched her pearl necklace as if trying to hold on to what little dignity she had left. Even the crew, those who had stood behind Madeline in silent agreement, now stiffened, their faces drained of color. But nothing compared to the look of sheer terror on Madeline's face. She staggered back, her chest tightening, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. No, this couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake. She hadn't just humiliated the most powerful man on this flight. She hadn't just raised her hand against the owner of the very airline she worked for. She hadn't just destroyed her entire career in a matter of minutes. Her throat felt dry, her tongue heavy, her mind screaming for a way out. She had to fix this. She had to plead. She had to undo what had been done. Her voice finally returned, small, fragile, desperate. "Sir, I didn't know. I never meant." But Mr. Johnson did not flinch. He did not smirk. He did not gloat. He simply looked at her with an expression that was both gentle and unyielding. And then he spoke. "You thought you could belittle me because of how I look." His voice was deep, steady, commanding. "You believed you had the right to decide who is worthy of respect and who is not." A hush blanketed the room. Every passenger felt the weight of his words pressing into their chests. Some looked away. Some fidgeted uncomfortably. Even those who had remained silent felt a gnawing guilt, because deep down, they knew he was right. Mr. Johnson took a slow breath, then recited, "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Luke 14 verse 11. It was not a threat. It was not an attack. It was a truth, one that no one in that room could deny. And that truth broke Madeline completely. Her knees buckled beneath her. She dropped, hard. A choked sob escaped her lips as tears streamed down her face. Her pride, her arrogance, her certainty, all of it was gone. She had spent years looking down on others. Now, she was on her knees before the very man she had humiliated. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but they came out weak, broken, nothing like the powerful woman she once was. "Please, forgive me." Her voice cracked. I didn't know." But Mr. Johnson did not flinch. He did not move. He simply looked at her with an expression that was both compassionate and immovable. "Forgiveness comes from God," he said. His voice was steady, his words unchanging. Each syllable landed with the weight of something eternal. "But consequences are ours to bear." Madeline squeezed her eyes shut, another sob racking through her chest, because she knew what was coming. And this time, she could not fight it. Mr. Johnson turned to the captain, his voice no longer soft, but firm. A command. "Make sure no one else is ever humiliated the way I was today." Then, without hesitation, "and fire her immediately." The words sealed her fate. Passengers stiffened in their seats, some sucking in sharp breaths. others nodding in quiet understanding. The young flight attendant, Grace, clutched the passenger list against her chest, her face filled with something that looked like both relief and sorrow. The captain's jaw tightened. He nodded once, and for the first time, Madeline did not argue. She did not beg. She did not plead. She simply sat there, on the floor, broken, defeated, drowning in the weight of her own choices. Because sometimes, the lessons that change us the most are the ones that come at the greatest cost. The world did not forget what happened on that flight. It wasn't just another viral video. It wasn't just another headline that would be swept away by the next big scandal. No, this story lingered. It echoed. It demanded reflection. Within days, footage of the incident had spread across social media, news outlets, and television broadcasts like wildfire. The slap, the stunned silence, the moment Madeline realized the truth, and above all, Mr. Johnson's unwavering calm. The quiet power in his words as he responded not with anger, but with scripture. Millions watched, and millions were moved. People who had once mocked and dismissed others based on appearance now felt a deep sense of shame. Those who had suffered humiliation and injustice finally saw something they had long prayed for: proof that God sees all, that He lifts up the humble, and that those who exalt themselves will be brought low. The discussion didn't stop there. Churches, workplaces, families, everyone was talking about it. Debates erupted. Some tried to defend Madeline's actions, saying she had simply been doing her job. Others argued that it wasn't just about her, it was about a deeper issue, a sickness in society that judged people by the surface and not by the soul. And then, one day, Mr. Johnson himself appeared on national television. The anticipation was electric. Millions tuned in. Across from him sat one of the most respected talk show hosts in the country. The cameras rolled. The studio lights illuminated the scene. And for the first time, the world would hear from the man at the center of it all. The host leaned forward, the curiosity in her voice evident. "Mr. Johnson, your story has reached millions. People are deeply moved by the way you handled the situation. But tell us, how did it feel, in that moment, to be judged so wrongly?" A pause. Mr. Johnson sat still, his fingers interlocked, his expression composed yet powerful. Then, he spoke. "People often judge others by their appearance." His voice was steady, measured, not one of bitterness or resentment, but of wisdom. But God does not look at the clothes we wear or the wealth we possess. He looks at the heart of every individual. A hush fell over the audience. Some nodded. Some leaned in closer, hanging on to every word. Madeline was wrong to believe she had the authority to decide who was worthy of respect, he continued. But it wasn't just her. The truth is, we have all been guilty of this in some way. We live in a world that rushes to judge. We see a person, and in seconds, we decide their worth based on their clothes, their status, their appearance. But God doesn't see the way we do. The host, visibly moved, took a deep breath before asking, "Do you forgive her?" Another pause. Then, a small smile touched Mr. Johnson's lips. "Forgiveness is not mine to withhold," he said. "It belongs to God, and I believe He offers it freely to those who seek it. But forgiveness does not erase consequences. She was given authority over others, and she misused it. That is something she will have to live with." The host nodded solemnly. Mr. Johnson looked directly into the camera, his gaze steady, and then he spoke the words that would reverberate across the world. "God is always just, so never look down on someone just because they don't fit your expectations, because the person you dismiss today may be the very one whom God has blessed far beyond what you could ever imagine." The studio was silent. For a moment, no one spoke, no one moved. Then, the audience erupted into thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. It wasn't just about the flight anymore. This was bigger than one woman's mistake. This was a wake-up call to the world. Beyond that studio, the story continued to spread, not as just another viral sensation, not as just another social media controversy, but as a lesson in humility, a lesson in God's justice, and a reminder that, in His eyes, we are all the same. If you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, hit like and share this story to spread this powerful lesson.